Hola, buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning. I'd just like to do a sound test with the headsets because sometimes if they're turned up too loud, we have problems with those that want to listen to the session directly. So we're now speaking to you in the English channel, and we're going to move over to the Spanish channel shortly, and we'll just move on to the Spanish channel now so that those that are listening in channel can talk.
Bueno, aprovecho para decir que os podéis descargar la aplicación del curso.
I'd like to also let you know that you can download the courses app if you would like to. There you can get videos from the courses. So anybody that's interested in downloading the app, you can actually do that, and you can session. Viewpoint, from a diplomatic and a political viewpoint. It was a very lengthy, action-packed session. The administrative services almost had to boot us out of the room because we didn't want to leave. Today, it's also we're also in the midst of an important day because we're going to try and deal with one of the major subjects of European overseas policies, which is the Western Balkans and their route towards the European Union, many of whom have been candidate countries for far too long. And to talk about that, we've got the Minister of Foreign Affairs from North Macedonia, Buhar Osmani. Can you hear me okay? And I'd like to say thanks to him for having made an effort to come and spend some time with us, even though it's a bit of a 24-hour whirlwind tour. He didn't arrive until yesterday, very late in Bilbao. So those of you that, all of you that makes an effort to come here and spend some time with us during holiday time. But I'm hoping that from the viewpoint of North Macedonia, which is currently immersed in the process of constitutional adaptation to join the EU, it's going to be really important for you to understand what's happening in the Balkans, who's who, what problems we find there, and what problems candidate countries have with us. We've also got with us Olta Shaka, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Albania for us. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us via Zoom. And also Gerald Naus, the Chairman of the European Stability Initiative, who has a great deal of experience in analyzing the accession process for many countries, and was also an expert in migratory processes. So he'll be here with us again tomorrow, talking about his experience with African migration. We've also got chairing this session, Esther Orsini-Rosenberg. So now that I've introduced our speakers today, let's going to hand the floor over to Minister Osmani. Thank you so much for being here. When you're ready.
Thank you so much. High Representative Borrell, dear Joseph, thank you for the invitation to be here today to this lovely city of Santander. It's my first time here in this part of Spain. Thank you to the organizers as well, to University Menendez y Pelayo for this timely gathering today. But not only that is timely, also it comes at the right place. Not because Spain holds the rotating presidency and this is the most appropriate place where we from the Western Balkans can express our concerns and expectations, but also Spain's story of integration into the European Union, its added value that it brought to the Union and the impact of the Union to the overall development of Spain is impressive and inspiring. Let me make first present the case of Western Balkans. Western Balkans is a region at the heart of Europe, a region that is historically, geographically, politically, economically, geopolitically part of Europe and should be part of the European Union. Starting from the historic perspective, if metaphorically we would visualize Europe as a grand tapestry, Western Balkans would be those vibrant threads blended in the great design as a reminders of our shared history from the Roman to the Byzantine and then further down in history. From a geographical point of view, Western Balkans are not a remote area at the periphery of continent, but right at the heart of Europe, but also at the heart of the European Union. And I took with me a map that we designed and showed during our PRESPA forum for dialogue, just to show that Western Balkans is an island surrounded by the EU Blue Sea, the missing puzzle for a complete Europe. 6 Western Balkan countries surrounded from all sides with EU member states. So geographically it is impossible to leave it aside. This gives us some confidence that EU will not be complete, successful, peaceful, sustainable project without integrated, peaceful Western Balkans. 6 Western Balkan countries, but don't get confused, they are the size of less than 1 member state, Romania, in our neighborhood, with only 18 million people on paper, around 15 million residents, around 1% of the GDP of the European Union, less than 4% of the EU population. 1%, or less than 1% of the EU GDP. I tried sometime to use another metaphor for this map. Seen by afar, it looks as a wound on a body. Because of my medical background, I often say wounds happen when there is an impaired circulation, when there is no connectivity within the region or with the rest of the European Union. There is no single market, no circulation of people, capital, services. And what wounds serve in a body? They either serve as a bleeding point or as an entry point for different germs that can contaminate and infect the rest of the body. Historically, Western Balkan has served as a bleeding point for Europe. World War I started in Sarajevo in Western Balkans. But also, it's becoming more and more an entry point for malign influences, from violent extremism, from migration crisis, through terrorism, organized crime, not stemming from Western Balkans, but using it as a port to enter Europe because of the vulnerabilities that this region has. There's a historian, Moshe Gleni, who said the history of Western Balkans was determined by its mountains, not enough tall to prevent the foreign big powers and occupators. And you have seen the history of Western Balkans is over the centuries being under occupation of big empires, but not short enough to allow communication between different parts of this region. So you have this term coined in pejorative terms, Balkanization, being used for regions or for phenomena of fragmentation, of miscommunication, of quarrels. What EU has shown in the last 20 or 30 years is that has provided the only source of cohesive tissue to bring this region together. It has provided the only driving force or engine to advance it in its reform agenda, and indeed the Western Balkans has come a long way. From the war trenches of 30 years ago, today we are talking about establishing a common regional market as a preparatory phase to a single market of the European Union. So this is the only cohesive tissue, the only glue keeping us together, providing this peaceful integrated region, which, as I said, is a precondition for a peaceful, completed European project, but also a driving force for the positive reform agenda, particularly focused on rule of law and fundamental rights. Now we understand the complexities of the environment in which EU functions, the hesitation that EU has toward enlargement, the need to deepen itself before widening itself, to prepare its or to adjust and adopt its decision-making in order to accept new members from Western Balkans. What we believe that these two processes are complementary. Preparation of the EU or EU getting ready to enlargement should go hand in hand with Western Balkans preparation to get ready to join EU. What we need is these two processes to get them aligned, to hook them along the way so they do not divert. So instead of creating a convergence between the two, we create a divergence also stemming from the intrinsic differences as well from the extrinsic influences and impacts. Being confident that there's no alternative to full membership of the Western Balkans into the European Union, what we need now is to maintain the credibility of the process along the way. Because at the moment, in between the pledge, and this year we mark the 20th anniversary since the Thessaloniki summit, when EU pledged to Western Balkans that one day will be part of the European Union. So from this pledge to the membership itself, there is a hollow gap. There's no scaffold to maintain its credibility. When there is no scaffold, it loses attractiveness, it becomes vulnerable and susceptible to external influences, particularly the Russian influence in the region. So therefore we proposed that we introduce the concept of more integration before membership, not as an alternative to membership itself, because it's impossible. As I said, geographically it's impossible to have an alternative to full integration of Western Balkans. Politically it's impossible. 85% of our economy is connected to EU's economy. But to provide a scaffold to maintain credibility, which means interim phases, interim scales, where we would walk on in order to reach full membership. So the Western Balkan countries become part of the system of value of the European Union, and the formal membership itself in the end becomes only formal momentum of sitting around the table. What do we mean by that? I hope I'm not taking too much time. In 3 cases, European Union proved that it can export its values and policies to the Western Balkans prior to membership itself. One is visa liberalization. We have freedom of movement just as the Europeans within the European member states move freely throughout Europe. We are part of the energy community and we are part of the transport community prior to becoming members of the European Union. We think that if we expand the policy areas where we would become part of along the way, after we meet criteria related to that policy area, there would be a huge incentive for the Western Balkans, but also as a preparatory phase for us to sit around the table and see how the system works and to make less friction in our relations, our trust, and our communication tomorrow as a full members of the European Union. We need access to the single market prior to full membership as we meet criteria. And this should be a meritocracy-based process, which means that if you meet certain criteria, you get rewarded. If you backslide, then you certainly move backwards in accessing those areas. We need access to cohesion and structural funds. Maybe Olta will talk later because it was mainly their analysis, but at the moment, the convergency gap between the candidates and the member states is becoming wider. Again, Olta will say it for sure because I got those data from them. 11 times our EU neighboring countries are getting, in terms of cohesive funds, more than us as pre-accession funds. So at the moment, today, our neighboring EU countries are getting 11 times more EU funds. That means that we are becoming wider and wider in terms of our economic and social cohesion with the European Union. So we need access to structural and cohesive fund before becoming members of the European Union. We need to become part of the single market, part of the different policy areas as we close those chapters related to that policy area. This, I think, would provide the best scaffold for us to walk on, and then the membership itself will be a natural follow-up step. It won't be a headline in the news, because we will already be part of the European Union. Instead of having all those hopes and promises reserved for the final moment, this final moment, unfortunately, has become a moving target, so frustrations are continually growing. These frustrations are undermining the credibility of the European Union in the Western Balkans. Whenever there is a loss of credibility, the gates open for influences of alternative solutions, whether it's from Russia or from different centers. We were hopeful when we heard this year, I think it was in Bratislava, when President of the European Commission announced this phased-in accelerated approach. We think that is in line with our policies. Again, and I'm going to close here, this is not an alternative to EU membership. We won't accept anything less than full EU membership because we think that we deserve it, because we think we are part of this system, and we think that is the most obvious reciprocal interest, both for the European Union to have access to this untapped pool of talent that are eager to become part of the EU and innovative narrative. We are the guardians of the gate, how I call. Let's just take the case of 2015 migration crisis, when 1 million people crossed North Macedonia just over a few months, and this alignment with the European Union showed that we are reliable partners to the European Union. Today we are 100% aligned with EU common foreign security policies. Today North Macedonia is one of the first 4 countries in NATO for providing military assistance to Ukraine. So this is what EU will get, what NATO got from our membership, a reliable partner which are at the gates of the Union and can be the best guardians of the gates. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Bujar. Después en el coloquio tendremos oportunidad de entrar.
Afterwards, in the Q&A session, we'll be able to go into more detail about the problems that North Macedonia is having to overcome during its route to accession. And now we're going to listen to Olta Shaka, the Minister of Overseas Affairs from Albania.
It's great to meet you all. I'm sure I'm missing a lot by not being there among you and not being in beautiful Santander. But dear Joseph, thank you wholeheartedly for this important opportunity to be part of this event and to address this little yet very big question, if I may call it so. It's a short question indeed, just 3 words. But we could spend the remainder of this year discussing Quo Vadis Europe and not even scratch the surface of most of the issues and scenarios. So I'll try to narrow the scope of the question to the territory that we are most familiar with and that we are very interested in, which is enlargement or the integration process, because you know the EU speaks of enlargement, but we non-members speak of integration process. Enlargement is just one issue among the thousands, perhaps, of issues of the twists and turns that face the EU as it tries to lay out a path for its future. However, it is an important issue, not just for those aspiring to become the subjects of enlargement, countries like Albania, and North Macedonia or the rest of the Western Balkans, but also for Europe itself, I think. Indeed, I submit to the colleagues that enlargement into the Western Balkans is the strategic low-hanging fruit of this Europe that is trying to convince the world that it can act decisively, that it can take ambitious and courageous decisions, that it can think and act strategically. This has always been important for Europe, but it is more important than ever today in the context of the Russian illegal war of aggression against Ukraine and of the general challenge to the existing international rules-based order. Now, the Western Balkans today in 2023 are a world away from the Western Balkans of the 1990s, when our region was feeding television screens around the world with images that were just as horrible and tragic as those coming out of Ukraine. The Western Balkans today are at peace. They are more stable and more peaceful and more secure than they have ever been at any point of our history. But how did we go from the horrors of 1990s to the reality that we have today in 2023? Of course, the military interventions that stopped the Milosevic war machine and brought peace to the region played a crucial role. But I think the real transformation of the region happened because the European dream we all believed in, because of the promise of enlargement, that if we left the politics of the past behind and worked to build a modern, democratic European state, we would one day join the European Union. Why is peace and stability and security in the Western Balkans so fragile and threatened today? I think because for too long, Europe failed to think about enlargement strategically, geopolitically, and gradually, I would say, managed to turn the integration process of the region from a strategic process that was one of the pillars of the EU project into a technical labyrinth with no seeming end point or an end date, into a moving goalpost, if I may put it this way. And indeed, there were moments when the whole idea of enlargement was put into question, and we started hearing about enlargement fatigue, the need for a pause, or how many or how most Europeans held negative views of the Western Balkans countries' accession, and so forth. Well, I think the problem with dreams is that people will believe in them and chase them only for as long as they are credible, only for as long as they are tangible. So, what happened to the Western Balkans was that after a while, the dream of EU integration began to look impossible. Just imagine for a moment that my father was almost the age I am now when Albania first embarked on its EU integration path. My oldest daughter is today just a little bit younger than I was back then. So when we are talking about years of waiting, we are not just talking about years of waiting. We are talking about generations of waiting and working and reforming and making sacrifices, all in the name of our European dream. And despite this, all support for EU membership in Albania remains above 90%. Imagine that. Indeed, support for EU membership amongst Albanians, wherever they live in the Western Balkans, is higher than among all other communities. Can you imagine that level of commitment to a dream? That despite these levels of support, there have been serious consequences. First, many people in the region do not share the Albanians' commitment and devotion to the European Union. Support levels for EU integration are much lower in other countries that are in Albania or amongst Albanians in the region. Second, other rival powers have made inroads and have built influence in a region where, in the aftermath of the wars in the former Yugoslavia, the EU enjoyed unchallenged strategic exclusivity. Russia, foremost among them, but also China and others. And of course, this has come at the expense of the EU. Third, and most dangerous of all, I think, this long wait and the years-long distraction on the part of the EU have given new breathing room to the old identity-based forces in our region. They never disappeared, that is true, but for as long as the EU dream was credible, was tangible, they shrank and lowered their heads. Now, you only have to look to Bosnia-Herzegovina, to the tensions in the north of Kosovo, and even in other places to see that they are once again a factor in our region, a fifth column for Russia, and an obstacle, if not a fully blown threat yet, to the region's progress towards integration and cooperation. I do not want to sound cynical, but it is true that for the Western Balkans, the tragic war in Ukraine has had positive consequences. It woke up the EU. It shaked it out of its technocratic slumber and forced it to think strategically. It took a war, but today the EU is more focused than before, and it is showing a willingness to act strategically vis-à-vis the Western Balkans. So in this context, I feel obliged to express our gratitude to our host, to my friend and colleague, High Representative Borrell, for all the work that you personally have been doing to keep the EU focused on our region, to advance our integration process and support us through it. And above all, for understanding and advocating the strategic dimension of the Western Balkans EU integration. There is a real change in the European Union's approach towards the Western Balkans, which we can only hope will last and will become concrete in the future. As I said at the beginning, this is a strategic low-hanging fruit that the EU can show that by engaging with the Western Balkans, just as it did in the late 1990s and early 2000, it can propel this tiny area, which, as Bujar rightfully said, sits right in the middle of EU territory, into development, into prosperity, and yes, hopefully EU membership. If I were to lay out our most important expectations that would come from the EU on this path, they would be as follows. First, we believe timing is of the essence, because 2024 will be the year of the European elections, and the process of nominating new leaders, a new program and direction to the Commission, which usually means that integration is put on hold. So we hope decisions on progressing in the next steps will be made within 2023 to avoid another delay in the process. We hope the EU will work with us on thinking about economic and social convergence, as Bujar also mentioned, because without helping the region narrow the development gap that in recent years has widened and not narrowed between the region and the EU, we will hardly make it further on our EU path. We also hope to get clear signals that the EU means business by starting discussions on its ability to accommodate newcomers into its legal, institutional, and financial frameworks. Perhaps it's too much to ask, but a tentative deadline could also provide us a framework and an aim so that we see clearly what and when something should be achieved and where the milestones are. Last, but certainly not least, I want to stress the need for messages of support and encouragement from our European partners, and a commitment on their part that enlargement will be merit-based and will not be used as a means of coercion to advance national agendas of individual countries at the expense of others. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Olta. Creo que ha quedado clara la importancia estratégica.
Thank you, Olta. I believe it's clear what the strategy is, the strategy needed for these countries. And of course, there's some fatigue when something so clearly wished by population it takes longer and longer. And as the minister said, one of the positive collateral effects of the war, and unfortunately of a war, has been that the accession process has become stronger once again. Let's now listen to Aurea Molto, Executive Director for Foreign Policy, who will give us the viewpoint of the other side of those countries that are already in the EU. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here once again. Please, High Representative, allow me to add something, because I believe that what I said yesterday, there was some confusion with my words. I am Executive Director for Foreign Policy, but foreign policy is this magazine. I don't represent any government nor the government of my country, because both in yesterday's sessions and today I am surrounded by ministers from EU countries and EU candidate countries, which is a privilege for me. But because of the name of the magazine and because of my role, I might be believed to be a civil servant or belong to a government, and it is not so. I'm just a journalist and observer, and therefore I speak as such. But of course I am Spanish. I am in contact with the Spanish government, but also with authorities from the EU and aware of what the discussions are, which allows me to know what the different positions are. And also something useful is that I can make comments that could be critical or are more in the margins of what is considered to be institutional. So having said this, I'm going to, as briefly as possible, present the position of the EU and really the Spanish position that now has the presidency of the EU, and therefore that's why it's an interesting moment to speak about this. And certainly, and as the ministers from both North Macedonia and Albania have just mentioned, there's a new imperative in the EU regarding enlargement. The enlargement is on the table, and we won't be able to not have it there if we don't give steps forward. It not only needs to be propelled, and therefore find new, more agile ways of being able to advance with the enlargement. We also need to try and be seen as, or the EU to be seen as more credible in the candidate countries, because of course there is fatigue in these countries because of the long wait, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Albania just explained, this being a generation problem with 3 generations waiting. And the Spanish position, I don't know if it reflects in general what the EU thinks. We know that right now, and as a journalist I'm able to say this, that it is true that in the EU there is a clear commitment towards enlargement, and it is also true that not all countries see things in the same way, and not all countries want to progress at the same speed, nor do they have the same objectives. But Spain's position reflects really well the spirit and global commitment of the EU, due to different reasons. First of all, because the enlargement is in the nature of the EU. It's always been part of the aspiration or aim of the EU, and Spain has always shared this. And there's 3 elements that I would like to focus on to explain this. Spain wants to progress in the enlargement, and this is one of the points included in their presidency, and they do so in a natural manner because it doesn't mean a change in position, because Spain in its European policy traditionally has always supported enlargement. It's always been in favor, and therefore it's a coherent position for Spain with the Spanish policy. And also, there's no party in Spain that is against. There's no internal forces nor social forces that somehow are not favorable to the enlargement of the EU. And this is interesting because the reasons for the support are fundamentally political ones, because Spain, one, is very loyal to the EU project, and as the minister from North Macedonia explained, our own history of our accession story is a reminder of how it has transformed our country. And we've also seen how Spain becomes a significant country in Europe that has contributed to the growth and ambition of Europe, and therefore we clearly see that enlargement benefits the country but also the EU. The financial reasons might be more fragile, and this means that our support becomes even more valuable, because the different accessions in the EU, well, in Spain, regarding the internal market or domestic market, hasn't been benefited with different accessions, because it's now more in the periphery. And this is what will happen when the process we're in now for enlargement ends. And this is something that has to be taken into account by all countries. It is true that enlargement means having a bigger, let's say, domestic market in a greater zone in Europe. And this is not only the financial space, but this is also a challenge in the country to try and get a better situation in the market. Secondly, and now that Spain has the presidency of the EU, well, Spain is an ambitious country in Europe, and therefore it has policies that are in the center of the EU, the migration policy, the Fit for 55, or the enlargement policy. So Spain has the commitment of progressing throughout these 6 months. In fact, in October, immediately after the meeting that will take place in Granada, and also Spain being aware that in the political Europe is different to the enlargement. I think the yearly report will be presented that will include, for the first time, Ukraine, Moldavia, and Georgia. So we are ambitious, but Spain is also demanding, and the government of Spain, like in many other countries in Europe, always takes into account the reforms that Spain had to put in place, the transition period, and therefore it is demanding in these reforms taking place and the progress, institutional progress and legal progress that is established in the treaties and in the enlargement process to take place. It is a long process with tons of documents, but Spain wants for the discussion on the enlargement to not be unfocused. They want this discussion to take into account the necessary changes that have to be made regarding the rule of law, for example, because the objective is not only to have a bigger Europe, but to have an enlarged and effective Europe, and therefore a Europe that is better for Europeans and is better for the world. A Europe that is large, bigger, and together. And this is not something that happens just because you add new countries. Because the EU needs to have the necessary structures, the resources, and the governance and decision-making process so that this union of 30 or 36 members is efficient and functional. And this means that at one point there will be needed a reform of the treaties. And this is the position of Spain, and this shows what is the situation and the discussion in the EU regarding the candidates. And I will stop here so that we have time for our later Q&A session. Thank you. Thank you, Aurea. You clearly explained that being the executive director for foreign policy doesn't mean that you work for the ministry. And you explained really well the position of Spain. And now we have the voice of the academia, of those that do not represent any government, but that are more than just an observer and analyst. Someone that knows the Balkans really well, Gerald Naus. Please tell us about the difficulties beyond Albania and North Macedonia that already had spokespersons. Can you speak about other countries in the region, please?
Thanks a lot for this invitation, dear Josep, and to the organizers. I have been following developments in the Balkans now for 25 years, and I realize how old we are getting. Living in Bosnia for 4 years right after the war, working there, and then working many years in Kosovo, also in North Macedonia, And I remember the year 2003 meeting President Trajkovski in Macedonia, thinking, should North Macedonia submit an application for membership? And at that time, some governments, including Germany and France, said, no, too early, don't do it. But North Macedonia persisted with the arguments that we heard today. It's important for peace, it's good for Europe. And so in 2004, North Macedonia applied for membership. Where are we now? Almost, 2 decades after the promise of Thessaloniki. If we are objective, we have to say that this process at the moment is in a deep crisis. And for all the reasons that Foreign Minister Osmani described, this is bad for the EU and it's dangerous for the EU. But there are ways out that have been sketched, and I want to build on that. That can be measures that can be taken based on what we know has worked before in the Balkans and in Europe. Now, what is the crisis? We have 6 Western Balkan countries, and of course now also Ukraine and Moldova, somewhere far behind Georgia, and in a different category, Turkey. But 6 Western Balkan countries, of which 2 have been negotiating with the European Union for a very long time. Montenegro for 11 years. There has never been a country that negotiated so long. Croatia took 5.5 years from the beginning of accession of the talks to the end, and it was the longest ever. Lithuania took 34 months, less than 3 years, from the beginning of the negotiations to the end. And Romania, 58 months. So, Montenegro, a NATO member, full alignment with EU foreign policy, no problems with its neighbors, a small country which costs very little, the population is less than the population of Barcelona. Montenegro has negotiated for 11 years. Now, to get into the EU, the Commission needs to say, and the Council needs to decide that all the chapters, all the different categories, conditions are met and they are closed. After 11 years of negotiations, Montenegro closed 3 of 33 chapters. Serbia is worse. Serbia closed 2. And the other 4 countries didn't close a single one because, in fact, North Macedonia and Albania, they didn't even get to the stage yet where the Commission and then the Council decide on closing chapters. So these 6 countries need to close together 130-something chapters and together closed 5. The worst thing is that in the last 6 years, no country closed a single chapter. For 6 years, no country closed a chapter in the Balkans, which is longer than it took Croatia to go from the beginning to the end. And that is why not politicians like the ministers we have here today, but the public is skeptical in those countries and says, why should we do all these hard reforms when we look around, a competition can motivate you, you see others running and then you want to catch up. But if nobody is getting anywhere, not even those who started 11 years ago, it can be very demotivating to do difficult things. And getting ready is difficult. So what can we do in this situation? The minister has pointed out that there were very positive experiences in the Balkans. When the European Union gave clear criteria and said it's up to you to meet them, and we will send our experts to assess if you meet them. We will be very strict on visa liberalization. All the countries surprised skeptics in some EU countries with massive reforms very quickly meeting all the conditions. The reason was that the goal was very clear. So politicians, and I remember that in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, politicians all through the summer were calling civil servants and said, listen, we have to work, no vacation this year. And in the end, Bosnia surprised everyone by meeting the conditions for visa liberalization. The same happened every time there was such a deadline. When North Macedonia was supposed to become a candidate, when North Macedonia was supposed to start accession talks, politicians could motivate all the civil servants, all society. People started working. I've seen it many, many times. So the question is, how do we do the two key ingredients which are missing? Because clearly it is not that the Western Balkans are less capable than Romania or Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia or Slovakia, all the other countries which have done it in a few years. What is missing? The credibility of the process, where people, not just politicians, the public believes it can work, and a clear goal. But now we come to the fundamental problem. The clear goal, at the moment, with 27 members, some members say, well, we can't give a clear goal because first the EU needs to change. We first have to make internal reforms. And who knows how long they will take? We don't know. Chancellor Scholz in Berlin, he says fast enlargement. But first we need to reform the EU. We don't know if that will take 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. Because in the end, if the reforms are big, they need unanimity. And so that's the problem. What's the clear goal? And that is why I think, and I'm coming to a concrete conclusion and a recommendation. If we have made the experience that in different sectors where the EU said you can join, let's say the transport community, where in the field of transport, the Western Balkans are fully integrating with the EU. If you do these reforms, well, why doesn't the European Union say, the Council in a conclusion, ideally with this Commission, with this European Parliament, perhaps even ideally this year, that any democracy, any Balkan country that meets the criteria assessed by the Commission, objectively, in its regular merit-based assessments, and has the rule of law, so we can trust that courts will implement the laws. Any country that objectively meets these criteria will get full access, not just in transport and energy, but across the whole of the single market. So the goal is full accession. There can be no alternative. That's the goal for everyone. But what the European Union can say now, if it looks about a reachable near-term goal, is to say, adopt conclusions in December at the European Council and say, if North Macedonia, in the eyes of the Commission, meets the criteria in these regular assessments and has a good preparation in the chapters, and that depends only on North Macedonia, and I'm convinced it could be done in 4 years. Certainly by 2030, North Macedonia would meet all these conditions, and Albania, and Serbia, and Montenegro, if they want to. And I think if politicians don't want to do that, they'll be voted out, because the public will believe it. Then they can join the single market and enjoy the 4 freedoms. Now, this was done twice already in European history. The first was, for my country, Austria, Sweden, and Finland. When the Union was not ready for enlargement in 1990, the Commission President Jacques Delors said, okay, we are not ready to let Austria in, or Sweden, or Finland, but if you meet the conditions, we negotiate now, if you meet the conditions, you can join the single market. And actually, Norway thinks it's such a good place to be that Norway decided to stay there for the last 20 years. It is in the single market. It has full freedom of movement for goods, people, services, but it decided not to join the EU. The other 3, when they had joined the single market, it took only 1 year to join the EU because they were ready. And then the politics had changed. And of course, once you're in the single market and it works, the argument that you will be a threat to the EU, well, it's not very credible, right? Because it works. So, it was done once for Austria. As I say, it's the Finnish way to the EU. But it was also done at the very beginning. The Union in the 50s tried to create a defense community, a political community, and it didn't work. And when that didn't work, the leaders of the Union said, well, then let's focus on removing barriers. The Treaty of Rome, which created the European Economic Community, said the goal is to remove all barriers between Europeans. If we go back to this now, we give a goal that I think would mobilize, and I've talked to many politicians in the region. I think if politicians can say, listen, it's up to us that citizens and businesses in Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and elsewhere, in 4 or 5 years, could enjoy the same conditions as those in Norway, Iceland, Austria, Poland, Lithuania. And it only depends on us. Judge us by what we do, but help us do it. I think we would see the whole region focus only on this. And what the Foreign Minister of Albania pointed out, the return of identity politics, of dangerous agendas, of changing borders and questioning, well, reopening the nationalist issues of the past. Nobody will have time for that because the public, civil society, the civil administration and politicians will be in a race. Who can first get there? And ideally, they all get there together. So I think if this would be a legacy of this European Parliament, this Commission and this Council, all it takes is a clear goal, a light tower like the one outside in Santander, which serves as an orientation. If by then, in the next 4 years, the politics changes and the EU is ready to say, well, if you meet the criteria, you can become a full member right away, all the better. I mean, that's what the goal is. But if the Union itself is not ready, the countries of the region should still know that their work will lead to a result. And if you offer this to all 6, then you would really transform the region. I actually think even Bosnia would then surprise us. So on this note, I thank you, and I think this would be a fantastic legacy for EU foreign policy because it would complete the transformation where also in the Western Balkans, conflict in the future will become unthinkable. Thank you.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. You will say something about Kosovo and Serbia in the conversation.
Yes.
And now I let Esther to manage the debate among you and the public. And since it is a little bit crowded, I will take my place among you.
I think we have enough space.
No. I have to make a phone call also. So, come on, Esther.
So thank you very much to the panelists. I think we've had very interesting impulses here. I know that Minister Jajla needs to leave at 11:15, so perhaps we open the floor for questions, starting with questions for the Minister. Would the audience like to? Yes, the gentleman here.
Sí.
Hello, my name is Luque Uribe Echevarria. I'm a representative of the Basque Nationalist Party in the Basque Parliament, or in the Spanish Parliament. We are in favor of the integration of the Balkan countries to the EU. In fact, I believe that North Macedonia and Albania should already be members of the EU. In any case, I want to go back to what Mr. Now said at the end of his presentation. My question is if it would be convenient or a good idea for the 6 candidate countries to join the EU together, or do you believe their accession should be individualized or per groups according to the criteria complied with by each and every one of them? Thank you. I have a couple of questions for the representative of North Macedonia. What is your position on Kosovo? And what is your position regarding the Srebrenica killing and Serbia?
Maybe we take 2 more questions. Back.
Mi pregunta también.
Hello, my question is also for the North Macedonia Minister. I'm Pamelia Varela. I also have a medical training. So in what phase of healing do you think you find yourself? So because you talked about the bleeding and now we are in the healing stage, so where do you find yourself? You also mentioned that to accelerate the healing process, we need to also take into account the financial side of things. And is there anything that you wish for to be able to accelerate the process and to comply with the criteria that are not complied with yet? Or what are the measures that you believe could be put in place by North Macedonia to make more agile this process and to comply with the criteria? Thank you. Thank you. My name is Cristina Gutierrez. I was for 15 years an MP at the European Parliament, and I have two questions. I don't know if this is feasible, but I believe that Europe, to integrate so many countries, needs to eliminate some of the obstacles that it is generating, that countries in Europe, like Hungary, distance themselves and do not accept the rules of the game. I believe that the foundation of Europe is a democratic system and an institutional reform, not only the market. So we need to have reforms that are protected from next elections that can try to destroy democracy. I believe that if we don't have a more clear common European policy regarding refugees and migration, something that hasn't been done. And coming from a country from the south, we've always demanded a more joint and solidary policy of all countries, and not that the countries in the south have a greater load of migration. And I believe, and do you believe, we need more policy at the EU and more progress and consensus in those policies that are a crisis or mean a crisis for Europe? Because when talking about Kosovo and the Balkans, I've seen a lot of racism, and if this isn't solved, I don't believe we will have an adequate migration policy. Thank you.
Buenas.
One last question, and then we give the floor to
Vale, yo soy Marcos Díez, estudiante de Derecho y Relaciones Internacionales.
My name's Marcos Dieth. I'm a student. My question is similar to the one that's just been raised. I'd like to know to what extent racism and dependency on extreme right-wing parties in countries such as Finland and Sweden, or the rise of right-wing parties in other countries such as France, may make it difficult for countries that have Muslim majorities to join the EU.
the floor for Minister Jacka, because she will need to leave us soon. And then we take a second round of questions afterwards. Minister, you have the floor.
Yes, there was a question that was addressed to me, whether the EU enlargement process should be merit-based. Yes, we definitely think it should be merit-based. As we've been discussing, it should be credible as well. So there should be end goals and end objectives, and the process should be tangible, it should be foreseeable, it should be predictable. That's very important. But the process should be merit-based, and yes, we have to do our homework, we have to fulfill our obligations, because we view the process as support for our country's modernizing transformation. I've always said it's not about exporting our problems in the European Union. It's about importing the best standards of the European Union member states into our own countries. And that's why we believe the process should be based on each country's reform achievements. And yes, we have been doing our parts, and we have been working very hard to have very positive progress in that context.
Yeah, I will have some medical chat, so please excuse us shortly. I mentioned that wounds, if are not caused by extrinsic forces, are caused by impaired circulation. And this is the main reason for wounds in a body. This is the same with the relation between Western Balkans and the European Union, impaired circulation. So you asked, what's the healing process? The healing process is to restore circulation, to restore the four freedoms: people-to-people communication, capital, services, integration into the single market, access to policy areas, access to structural and cohesive funds, even before membership, in order, as I said, to maintain the credibility, to adjust the countries and their relation along the process. I think this is the only way that will integrate Western Balkans and will put the last missing puzzle in a completed European peaceful project. And therefore, the initiative that has stemmed from the region, so has not come top down from the European Union and imposed on us, but it's coming from us, is more membership before integration as an accelerated phase in access to the European Union. The process is merit-based, and we are not talking about bypassing strict regulations. We are not asking for an easy access. It's a merit-based process. As we meet strictly criteria, objectively assessed by the European Commission, the countries should be part of those policy areas. In the past, we used to be invited in the Gymnich meeting, Mr. High Representative. Lately, we are not. And I think we should reverse those approaches when EU invites Western Balkans, just as you invited us in the Foreign Affairs Council in May in Brussels. So we restore communication, we restore trust and the process. I was asked on Kosovo. Kosovo is an independent country, is a vibrant democracy that in 15 years of its existence has passed the test of democracy and has shown to be a reliable partner of international community. North Macedonia has recognized Kosovo and has established excellent bilateral relations. We are so proud that High Representative Borrell decided the talks between Serbia and Kosovo to take place in North Macedonia, in Ohrid, which I think was a successful exercise for both. And we just call both Serbia and Kosovo to continue implementing the provisions of the Brussels Agreement and the Ohrid Annex in order to reach a comprehensive agreement which is centered on mutual recognition. And we think that that's the only way for all countries in the Western Balkans to continue their journey of integration into the European Union. Regarding Srebrenica, Srebrenica has been already ruled by international courts as genocide, and this is the approach of North Macedonia, and I regularly participate in the commemorative ceremonies in Srebrenica, whether online or in person, to mark this terrible mark of human civilization. I don't know if I can just, since I took the floor, I didn't mention the case of North Macedonia. I mostly made the case of Western Balkans in principled approach why Western Balkans should join European Union. But let me say just few words about North Macedonia's case. So North Macedonia was the first country in the Western Balkans to start the European journey. It was way earlier than 2003. It was in 2001 when we signed the Stabilization and Association Agreement with the European Union. And we did it few months before Croatia. So few months after Slovenia, few months before Croatia. We were the first package, the first troika that in the region were considered as the promising country that would join first the European Union. Unfortunately, our trajectory derailed because of bilateral issues being introduced into the process. So first, Greece didn't like our name, so we were vetoed for 20 years, even though since 2009, We became candidate country in 2005. In 2009, European Commission recommended to the Council that we have fulfilled all necessary criteria to start the accession talks. 11 times in a row, European Commission gave this recommendation to the Council. In the Council, it was refused because of this name issue with Greece. In 2018, we reached this breakthrough solution with Athens, reaching the PRESPA agreement. We changed the name of the country for the sake of integration into the European Union and into NATO. It was the most painful process for our people. And it still is. Again, go into the wounds are still unhealed from that painful process we did go through. And we even organized a referendum asking people, are you willing to join EU and NATO with a new name? After we changed the name, we changed constitution. Unfortunately, we were vetoed again. This time, not by Greece, unfortunately then by France, because of the need to introduce the new methodology, which we also accepted willingly, saying that we are not asking for easy ways. Please impose on us the most strict possible rules, but objective rules, not bilateral issues, not issues related to historic interpretation with our neighbors, not issues related to disputes, bilateral dispute, but Copenhagen EU criteria. Impose on us the most strict ones. After that, Bulgaria unleashed and unloaded its own demands related mainly to historic interpretation and identity issues, totally unrelated to the EU process. And this is the reason why North Macedonia, even though started first in 2001, almost 22 years ago, just last year started the accession talks, but again conditioned with a new round of constitutional changes. So in order to open chapter 23 and 24, because someone mentioned here it's about institutions being protected for next elections, this is chapter 23 and 24, which are the overarching chapters that open first and are closed last just before membership. What we are asking is, let us open the chapters. Let us open the chapters of rule of law so we turn on the reflectors, the lights on the country in order to establish rule of law, to establish a system which is in line with the European ones. Unfortunately, as I said, we are in a process of changing the constitution. At the moment, we are working on achieving two-thirds majority, which is required for constitutional changes. Opposition is against. Riding on these frustrations of our people from this process that has become a moving target, opening constitution just 2 years after the previous rounds when we changed the name. It's not an easy one, neither for us as politicians, neither for the citizens, but we consider that this is the only way forward, because not only North Macedonia, the entire region doesn't have an alternative, and again I will say cohesive tissue, a supra-narrative that will subordinate the identity politics, the conflicting narratives in North Macedonia and in the region. It's the only narrative where different people, ethnic groups, cultural group, religious group share same ideals. And this is European Union. You take that out, you take this umbrella narrative, immediately you will have surface these conflicting narratives that we already see the tips of the icebergs of this conflicting narrative surfacing, because the umbrella has gotten holes in it. So let's patch those holes. Let's restore the strength of the European Union idea in the region. That will bring benefits for Europe, but also for the region. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Minister.
If I may add on the analogy or the metaphor that Boyar is using on the wounds that can be can be exit points, but that can also be access points. It's very worrying that we've seen very, very concrete efforts by Russia to undermine the security of the Western Balkans. which they correctly identify as Europe's soft underbelly. And the main characteristics of such threats, of such hybrid threats that Russia uses in the region are disinformation, is a strategy of communication that shapes political narratives in our countries, in the Western Balkans countries. We've seen interference in political processes. We've seen cyber attacks, leveraging economic influence for political means. For example, the energy as a tool of foreign policy. We've seen it in our region. Also, Russia has reinforced its activities in the Western Balkans. It is using ethnic and religious tensions. It is backing nationalist and anti-Western groups, and it is also undertaking actions to prevent the consolidation of peace and stability in our region. And I think that Russia's ultimate strategic goal is the blocking of reforms and the derailing of our Euro-Atlantic integration efforts and reforms, the reform achievements that we've had in our region. So in that sense, that analogy, that metaphor is, I think, is very real, that this wound has become an access point to be contaminated, to be germed. And I think that this crisis that has been caused by Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and also the threats against all countries that have supported the imposition of political and economic sanctions against Russia, has increased the risk of destabilization of some of our countries in the region. The increasingly threatening tones from Russia towards the countries of the region, the inclusion of some of the states of the region in the list of unfriendly states, such as Albania and North Macedonia, are an indication of Russia's objectives and its policy of intervention in the Western Balkans, and the danger that this intervention presents to the region. The other thing that I'm worried about, and it's something that we should consider, the way Russia comes out of this war, whether it comes out defeated, I hope, or even victorious. The second line of pressure would be to move westwards. Whether it comes out victorious or whether it comes out defeated, I believe that Russia will want to see westwards, so in the eastern flank of NATO, and Russia will want to destabilize the Western Balkans as a secondary line of pressure. And I believe whether it is to instigate the isolationism of certain Western countries or whether to destabilize the Western Balkans, Russia is a threat. And third country influence are a threat in the region unless this wound is closed, this wound is taken care of, unless we all work together not to allow such rival powers, such third-party influences to continue making inroads in our region.
Thank you very much. Aurea, would you like to come in as well?
No, escuchando al...
Listening to the ministers now, and this is actually really a question, an open question. It's true, the problem is that in the current situation, if you're an accession country, that actually means nothing. It's kind of meaningless today. So the EU needs to move away from this situation. As the Minister of Albania has just explained, if citizens, not just governments, but citizens in candidate countries don't have this horizon, don't have a possibility of the EU, then they will tend towards nationalist populist promises. And we're seeing that in some of these countries. And it's true that there's an increase in nationalist and populist movements in these countries, which at the same time become just another argument for some EU members to not move to enlargement, because they feel that with enlargement, then these problems will come to us. So you get these space for these campaigns of disrepute And it shows, at least as far as Russia's concerned, that European Union is incomplete. It's not going to provide any kind of solutions for your problems. So, and there are many purposes for enlargement. It currently has a clear geopolitical goal, and we need to move forward from current impasse. And I'd like to ask now Gerald, who explained quite clearly the situation today and these very, very long waiting and transitory processes, and in some cases, the zero progress in some of the chapters. I'd like to ask him the following. There have been several proposals recent years to reform or to transform the enlargement process so that it's not so weighty, so it's not so difficult, so that it'd be more effective. Not that it shouldn't be so strict, but it should be more effective. There are two of them. One, which is the most advanced, which is association for enlargement. I mean, can you comment about this? This is a question directly for you, Gerald, and also for our ministers. What do you think about these proposals that are out there? And I don't know whether you can call them intermediate solutions to accession, but what do you think about that? About these proposals? Do you think they can be effective solutions? Can they help more concrete progress?
Well, just perhaps one word on how important the region is also to the EU. If, and this unfortunately is now thinkable again, there are new conflicts in the region. I fear that this will be very bad also inside the European Union. And why am I fearing this? I'm reading the newspapers in Serbia. If you read the newspapers in Serbia in the last half year, you think there already is a war. I mean, you read the biggest selling mass tabloid in Belgrade, which is very close to the politicians in government, and they are saying every day, literally, that there are pogroms, ethnic cleansing, crimes against Serbs in Kosovo, every day. And in Kosovo you have KFOR, OSCE, UNMIK, reporting. You can read the reports. There are no pogroms in Kosovo. I mean, I just met the Serb minister in the Kosovo government 2 weeks ago. You know, he lives in Gračanica, in a Serb part of Kosovo. He's the minister in the government. He's now negotiating for a bigger budget for return of Serbs to Kosovo, Mr. Rašić. I mean, there are no pogroms. But he is being put under pressure in the same newspapers in Belgrade. They say he's a traitor for working in the Kosovo government. His son is kept at the border for hours, intimidated, and his advisor, who is a diabetic, was kept at the hour by the Serb authorities at the border between Kosovo and Serbia, incommunicado. There is an attempt to try to create an atmosphere that, you know, you Serbs are under threat and you need to use military means to help them. This is not me saying it. Look at what the newspapers say. Look at what the politicians say in Belgrade. And it reminds me of a preparation for conflict. Now, the problem is, if there is a new conflict like this, who would love it the most? It's Russia. And there are countries inside the EU and there are parties inside the EU. I mean, the far right in some of the European countries is not only very pro-Putin, it is also going to turn the Balkan policy into a war of civilization. You know, the far right in Austria, which is at 30%, is very anti-Albanian. It says we should fight Albanians. The far right in Germany is very anti-Muslim. So suddenly we will get, if we have new conflicts, if we don't integrate the region, we will have real tensions also inside our societies in the EU. So what we need to do, and that's why we need to be fast, we need to show to everyone, Albanians and Serbs and Macedonians and Bosnians, that the road that has made conflict unthinkable is open to them. So the question is, how realistic is this, that we can do this fast? Now, let me take Serbia and Kosovo. In those years, when the same present Serbian president was then prime minister, believed that there was a chance to join the European Union, 2010, 11, 12, 13, Serbia signed all sorts of agreements with Kosovo. Very far-reaching agreements. The EU was mediating, and the EU said, this is a great success. We are a great mediator, it works. One reason it was a success was because Serbia wanted something from the EU. It wanted start of accession talks, first candidate status, then start of accession talks, then opening of chapters. Until 2014, the Union said each step, you get it if you sign an agreement with Kosovo. And Serbia did, and they were implemented for a few years. But when then Serbia saw what happened to North Macedonia, the Serbian president gave a press conference and said, listen, it's over. You know, he made fun. He actually came to Tirana at one conference and said, you, Albanians, North Macedonia, you will never join, and we will, you know, it's over, it doesn't work. And he started to attack, and the media in Serbia starts to attack the EU all the time. So today, the majority of young Serbs are no longer pro-EU. I'm sure this can change quickly. But they are not pro-EU because they are being told it's not a real prospect. If we don't have a credible prospect, why would Serbia make any compromise, any concessions in Kosovo? You know, it will not. You know, it will not. It will say this is our territory. We are prepared to make concessions if it helps us join the EU. But if the EU is not real, we will not make compromises. On the other hand, why should Kosovars make compromises when they have no EU perspective? Or even worse, in North Kosovo, where about 50, 60,000 Serbs live, at the moment, the message to the Serbs in Kosovo is, if you are in Serbia, you might join the EU. If you're in Kosovo, you will never join the EU because Kosovo is not a candidate. So actually, we are disintegrating Kosovo. If we would offer to all 6 countries a status neutral, because not all in the EU agree on Kosovo's status, but a status neutral process to join the single market now, like we did with the transport community where Kosovo is a full member. There are 6 countries in the transport community of integrating with the EU. If we offer this for the whole single market, I guarantee you, we would have immediately, the EU and the mediation process would immediately have leverage again on both Serbia and Kosovo. Because actually these talks are not between Belgrade and Pristina. They are between Belgrade and Brussels and Pristina and Brussels. And each one says, if I get something on the road to the EU, I make painful concessions. So the trouble about mediation is that if the EU process collapses, we could have, as I keep saying, it's not the problem of, you know, there's a lot of criticism of the mediator, Mr. Lajčák. It's not the problem of the mediator. You know, you could have Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama, you know, if there is nothing they can offer. The Serbian president says it openly. You know, why should I make concessions? And that's the danger that I think we heard about, going back to the old nationalist issues, talking about borders, talking about ethnic rivalry, talking about history. This we need to change quickly. Now, last point, how realistic is this? I think it is realistic. The only thing in the last 2 years on which both President Vučić and Prime Minister Kurti agreed, and I have the quotes, I can share them with you. They both said, we want to join the single market. Mr. Vučić said it twice after a meeting with High Representative Borrell. He gave a press conference. He said, if we can't join the EU, at least give us the prospect to join the single market. This is the Serbian president. And in 2021, Albin Kurti, the Prime Minister of Kosovo, came to Brussels and said, give us a perspective that we can join the single market, like Norway. So if there's one thing both agree, well, let's use this. And it's good for Moldova, it's good for North Macedonia, it's good for Albania. And there should be a competition between the countries. You can't force them to wait for the last. That would be very, very bad and not merit-based. But in reality, the top are not that far apart. So in the end, if you give everyone the same goal, I'm convinced they might all reach the end goal relatively quickly together. And that would be best for the region, because imagine if we have borders between the countries of the Balkans today that look like the borders between EU countries, invisible. Or between Ireland and Northern Ireland, where Northern Ireland stayed in the single market for goods, where you don't see the border. then the tensions on these borders will disappear. Why would you fight if the borders between North Macedonia and Kosovo, Kosovo and Serbia, Serbia and Bosnia, look like the border between France and Spain and France and Germany? You know, you don't feel them. And that's the vision for the next 5 years, which we should work on. And that, I think, is realistic. And I hope that the Union will be successful soon, because time is running out.
Thank you very much, Gerald. I have to say I fully agree with you, but perhaps we open the floor for another round of questions, and another High Representative would like to ask a question.
¿Vas a dar más palabras?
Aquí dos preguntas.
Sí, buenos días. Mi nombre es Andrés.
Good morning. My name is Andres Martinez. I represent foreign policy at the government of Andalusia. And today we're talking about enlargement and neighborhood. And I would like to talk about another candidate, Turkey. I would like to ask about Turkey, that of course doesn't belong to the Balkan areas. But at one point they were very close to progressing in their integration, but in the stage in which we find ourselves, in which there's a different international relationship, and when there's not so much weight of the EU in the world, I consider that a state like Turkey, that has a great demographic and economic and military weight, could contribute to the future of the EU. Of course, with the authoritarian Erdogan government, this country is now further away from this integration process in the EU. So my question for the speakers is specifically for Gerald Naus. What do you believe? Do you believe with a change in the government of Turkey, and if they get closer to the EU, do you believe it's feasible for Turkey to become part of the EU? And therefore we would have greater weight regarding democracy, economy, and military aspects. Thank you.
Round of answers. I don't know if you would like to come in.
Well, on the last question on Turkey, I lived 7 years in Turkey, but I think if we open this now, it will be going on too long. So we can talk directly. I mean, I think what Turkey shows us is just one thing, that starting accession talks alone is not enough. And that, I think, is a warning also for Ukraine and other countries, that if you start accession talks and after a few years the public feels it doesn't go anywhere, you lose influence, and Turkey has gone backwards. I mean, the Commission assessments are very clear. Turkey was readier on the chapters, but also, of course, on the rule of law 10 years ago than it is now. So this accession process has not helped us transform. But otherwise, I mean, I was just in Ankara a month ago. There's a lot to be said. Of course, Turkey is crucial, but I think it goes too far away from this. But we can gladly talk outside.
Solo un 30 segundos.
Just 30 seconds, because the issue of Turkey is quite complex, but the process is paralyzed since 2018. And Turkey is an example of what has gone on. And even if you're a candidate and advancing your chapters, that doesn't mean anything for the country. So we could ask ourselves, what would be of the EU and Turkey if we would have progressed in the past, and if Turkey was now a member of the EU? And right now, the Turkish government and society are not looking towards the EU nor have any aspirations. And I believe Turkey is an example of the risks existing when not knowing how to progress and comply with and meet your promises, because we have a foreign policy as the EU that we need to advance on. I'm really sorry, but we're quite delayed, and Turkey would be one different chapter, one different session, in fact, because the Balkans are the Balkans and Turkey is Turkey. Because even though it's close, it's not the same thing. And we will finish in China, which will be the next session. Thank you, dear ministers. Thank you, Mr. Naus. Thank you, Aura, Esther. We cannot have a break because we have the next speaker ready for the talk. So we say goodbye to the ministers and to Gerald, and we will now connect with Daniela Schwarzer for the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ya está. Ya se le habla por el micrófono.
Good morning, Daniela.
Ahora.
Good morning, Daniela. You hear me?
I can hear you, yes, hello.
Okay. First of all, I would like to apologize for the delay, but as you know, it's very difficult to have the exact time. Okay, muchas gracias.
Good morning. I would like to thank you, everyone. We've had a very interesting session on the enlargement and the Balkans. We had patiently Daniela Schwarzer waiting for us, and I apologize again for this. And now we're going to look east, and we will talk about the EU vis-à-vis Russia and its alliance with China. Daniela comes from a think tank and the academia. She's been a professor in Berlin in the Harvard Canada School, and she, after many years working for the German Marshall Fund and the Notre Hoppen and Jacques Delors Foundation, is now a member of the Bertelsmann Stiftung Executive Board. She's one of the best-known international analysts to speak about the magical triangle between Europe, China, and Russia. Daniela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. And let me start with a regret and apology that I can't be with you in Santander this time. I very much enjoyed my visit to this conference some years ago, and I'm really sorry because of an own event I couldn't travel. The topic you have given me, I think, relates very well to what was discussed on the previous panel on the Western Balkans, but also what was the subject matter of many of the discussions yesterday, in particular, the situation in Ukraine and with Russia. So I was asked to look at the relationship of the EU with China and Russia and between the two. And I would like to first analyze what has happened over the past years and months, and then think through what this means for the European Union. Now, if we maybe start, because Russia was pretty much discussed over the past sessions already, let me start indeed with China. The EU, in my view, has found a pretty consistent stance on China, in now for a few years analyzing it as both a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. And this is very much reflected by almost all member states in similar terms. And what this says is that, yes, on the one hand, we need China for our economic ties, both trade, but also mutual investment, research, and other parts of relevant to competitiveness. But we are looking at this in a more cautious, far more cautious way. And the term of de-risking has found its way into EU language since Ursula von der Leyen coined that term this year. And I think it serves as a very good headline for the EU's approach to China and member states' approach to China. What we see is that over the past years, and actually this started already under the previous Commission, that the EU has done quite a bit to, first of all, increase transparency and reduce the risk emanating from ties with China that could be used against the European Union and its member states. So Jean-Claude Juncker launched the idea of an investment screening mechanism still under his term, which was then implemented into EU law and then translated into national law under this current Commission. But this is the first and visible and important step. What does it say? It says Europeans want to know who invests. It's not only a China law, of course, but China is one of the key targets here. Who invests in critical value chains? Who is present in our economy and to which degree? And how can this potentially influence not only our economic well-being, but also our security? This whole debate, and I was an expert in parliamentary hearings on the matter in Germany at the time when it was implemented into law, it was heavily influenced by the COVID experience. So I think it was crucial to understand that it is not only the tech sector and highly sensitive technologies that are relevant, but it is also the health sector and many more. At that point in time, when the COVID crisis fully hit Europe and the world, we understood how fragile our production chains are, how fragile our ties with key countries and trade partners are. And since then, I think, although the law is older, there was a true political move to consider the risk of dependencies more deeply and more broadly, really spanning more sectors. So I would say that today, and look at the German-China strategy that was just published a few weeks ago, I think the pendulum in that trias of terms, partner, competitor, and systemic rival, has definitely moved more towards the competitor and systemic rival field without giving up the partnership. But at this moment, and I quoted Ursula von der Leyen already, the caution prevails. This, of course, is not only an economic issue, but the issue of China's influence in our societies, in our public spheres, has also gotten much more attention. We have been discussing this issue for Russia for a very long time, but Chinese interference with hybrid means is at points more sophisticated than Russian influence and very targeted. And so as a result of that, we see in the European Union right now a very serious review of ties, for instance, in the academic sector, which I think are very relevant to assess. And what we still need to build are the principles for assessing whether we can still have partnerships, under which conditions, what terms of transparency and data protection need to apply, because it is in no one's interest, neither in the European one nor in the Chinese one, to break down those ties entirely. But the conditions have to be consciously set by Europeans, just as they do for China's presence in our economies, in our infrastructure. A final thought, what has also happened in that field of economic ties? Of course, Europe has measured its risks not only vis-à-vis a potential deterioration of the relationship between the EU and China, but it also considers scenarios for a further deteriorating relationship between the US and China. And while we remember very well the times when Donald Trump asked Europe to decouple, which never happened in the US, which will never fully happen in Europe, in my belief, the tone has changed in the US. It is more subtle, but also more risk aware. And my point here is that I think as Europeans, we should make sure that we are in a constant and strategic dialogue with the United States on our joint view of China, because there is, of course, an escalation risk in security terms and economic terms between China and its neighbors. And the US has already taken very clear positions that it is actually going to retaliate any attack that China might take on Taiwan. So as Europeans, I think, it's not enough to just look at China. We need to look at the triangle, China, the US, Europe, and I'll come to Russia in a moment. And we need to make sure that we are, first of all, alert of risk scenarios that may materialize, but also that we continuously work on our own inner European strength to stand our ground in this relationship. This is not only because there is a risk of more tensions, but it is also because we need to make sure we are a potential capable and attractive partner to the US if we think through the scenarios of the US elections in 2024, which may bring in a president who is much less transatlantic than Joe Biden is at the moment. Even this very transatlantic president, Joe Biden, has taken industrial policy measures which put Europe under great pressure. I'm thinking foremost of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, why is this relevant for our thinking about China? Of course, because we have to think through how the Inflation Reduction Act weakens our own economic fabric, whether we will see investment going from Europe to the United States. And we also need to make sure that as the US surely makes a leap forward in competitiveness, in particular in green technology, that we can partner with the United States on those issues rather than feeling left behind and being weakened structurally, because this industrial policy program does create incentives to move into the US market. So again, I'm at the point of inner strength. For us, the agenda of a forward-looking, sound industrial, economic, and social policy in Europe, in my view, is key, because we have a very strong asset, and that is the single market, that is a competitive industry. But we are also running through deep, deep transitions, the economic transition, the digital transition, where if we lose certain economic partnerships, in particular, as we now look at in a more differentiated way at some technology partnerships with China, we have to make sure we can keep up and even lead on certain technologies. Now, let me make a remark now on the China-Russia relationship. I think there are two important aspects I would like to put out to you for discussion. One is the relationship between China and Russia as two authoritarian-led states that clearly have an appetite to shape order, regional order, and global order. I believe that for some time we underestimated the willingness of both leaders to cooperate on the issue, and that they prepared certain developments that now materialize with the BRICS summit that is happening as we speak, could be seen before the war on Ukraine, this phase of the war on Ukraine started in February last year. You may remember that there was a visit by Vladimir Putin in Beijing while the Olympics were going on in China. And what Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping did was they published a paper which basically outlines an authoritarian worldview, which clearly has a deep criticism of the US-shaped and US-led liberal Western world order as we as Europeans know it and liked it, because we built our European model right into that global order, which is characterized by open economies, by the rule of international law, by international organizations. And suddenly we saw that both are lining up together to explicitly challenge that order. Individually, they had done that before. If you go back into Putin's speeches and readings, the notion of American dominance and of the criticism, not only in economic and global governance terms, but also with regards to the European security order, has been present all the time. And over the past years, and in addition to what has happened in the EU's eastern neighborhood, in particular with Ukraine, but also with the attacks on Moldova and previously also Georgia, Russia has intervened heavily in other countries, also, of course, in the Middle East. So it has de facto, well before this phase of the war, pushed itself back to the global negotiation tables as a power that co-defines structures of order and had settled agreements, for instance, in Syria. Very much to the discontent of many Europeans who felt that this order is definitely not what, from a European perspective, should be installed. Now, China and Russia take this initially bilateral cooperation clearly forward, and I think the most notable development that we need to analyze once the results are out is indeed the BRICS summit that is happening in South Africa at the moment. If you look at the interviews and statements that were given by some of the BRICS leaders before they went there or upon their arrival, you clearly see a reflection of what China has said on several occasions, that it is about challenging the current world order and defining something new, defining an alternative model. And of course, we know it's not only discussing theoretical ideas, but the order is being reshaped as we speak. So regional structures of order have already emerged. Take the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or other regional arrangements in Asia. Take Russian initiatives. Take also the role that China has played in recent years in Western-style international organizations, where it has clearly invested a lot in terms of staff, in terms of money, to get a stronger position. So from a Western political and a European perspective, of course, the question is not whether the international order will change, but I think how it will change and how we can bring ourselves back into the conversation. Right now, what we see is the BRICS states plus the applicants to the BRICS group, plus more states that are present in South Africa. They are discussing among themselves. And one European leader, Emmanuel Macron, who intended to go there or showed some interest, was clearly not invited. So at this moment, we see a discussion among countries that are critical of the current order, while we as countries in the EU, the US, Canada, others, are clearly interested to safeguard the order. But what we have to do, in my view, is to enter into a conversation how to reshape the order. the war on Ukraine and the fact that many countries that are either called Global South or the undecided or something else, there's no way to generalize them with a good term. And I'm not generalizing here. But what I observe is, of course, that the war and the reactions to the war highlighted that many countries that we deem relevant and would like to have on our side very clearly balance their interests and take tactical positions, but also have very long-lasting relationships with, for instance, Russia, which they can't throw out of the window overnight. And so, for instance, if you look at India, a country which is emerging as one of the most powerful economically, population-wise, and also in security terms, one of the powers of the world, has both ties with Russia and is rebalancing its relationship with the West, and in particular the US. So I think today we are in a phase where the world is much less clear than we thought it was. It has now surfaced that we are in a world where power relationships are changing, and the rise of Asia, which we have discussed since the 1990s, now materializes in a number of key players. China, I've mentioned, India, I've mentioned, Indonesia is also a very important player. And we also see that countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia are also intensifying their relationships, in this case, with the US and also with Europe. So we are seeing a redrawing of bilateral relations and of minilateralisms. Another example to illustrate this point can be the meeting between the United States, South Korea, and Japan on security matters a few days ago, which very clearly shows that even countries that have a complicated bilateral relationship in their region, as South Korea and Japan have over some issues, they get together because of the strategic perspective they are sharing on the risk of an escalating situation in the Indo-Pacific. Europe is not present enough in that world region. Some of the European member states have declared their readiness to be more present. France, for example, the UK, clearly not an EU member, but a relevant security player in Europe, also in the Indo-Pacific. Germany has at least issued Indo-Pacific guidelines, but has so far not really delivered substantial moves in terms of a change of policy, but it has signaled the interest to cooperate. A restructuring of concrete defense projects, take for instance AUKUS, where the US comes in with a truly new intensity of cooperation on nuclear submarines. So I believe that we see to what extent the West is involved in the Asian security arena, while on the other hand, Asian players are also involved in the European security arena. And we close with an example on that point, and that is China's support, Japan's support, sorry for that mistake, Japan's support for Ukraine, but also for a country like Moldova, which I suppose before the beginning of this phase of the war wasn't seen as a country that strategically should be supported, but now it is. And this clearly shows that from a Japanese perspective, the expanding power of Russia in Europe's eastern neighborhood is a big worry. And while there is investment into the priorities of the political West in Europe, there's also an expectation in Tokyo that Europe takes a stronger interest in security matters in Asia. So for time reasons, and the other session overran quite decisively, and I know lunch is coming up, I will leave it here, and I'm really looking forward for discussions. Maybe as a conclusion, let me say that I do believe that Europe has made steps forward in starting to think together strategically, the strategic compass, the strategic documents on China, the fact that we have developed late and maybe small, but still a response to the Belt and Road Initiative. We need to expand our strategic thinking and go deeper on certain areas. Let's quote Africa here, where we know that both China and Russia are key players in security terms, but also in economic terms with infrastructure investment, energy, and in particular access to rare resources. And Europe can no longer afford not to think strategically about these regions in light of Chinese and Russian activities in our neighborhood and also in other world regions. And again, I do believe that only if we come to the either negotiation table or to the trade negotiations or whatever the topic is, be it economic, be it security, be it resilience of societies and democracies, that the European Union will only be able to make a difference if it continues to invest and invests more on its internal cohesion and its joint competitiveness. Because we know that China and Russia also have a strategy to divide Europeans. And in the moment where we are weak or individual countries are weak, it is far easier to play individual national governments against others. So there is within the European Union a very strong need for mutual reassurance and clear showing that the relationship with the key players are understood in a European logic. And I'm saying this as someone who comes from Germany and knows how much skepticism is always put at the moment on Germany's China policy and previously on Germany's Russia policy. I think it is a real, true political challenge and importance that European member states understand that it's not about reaping short-term benefit from a privileged relationship to China now that helps us compete and stand our ground as a union of democracies in the medium and long term. So I believe exchange of information, transparency on the relationships, and also internal investment into our own competitiveness so we can protect the single market and its attractiveness, which is one of the bases of our global negotiation power, is really as much a priority as it is to look at our strategic relationships with key partners in the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Daniela. Reshaping the global world, the need for the European Union to be more present. How many food for thoughts. Thank you for your intervention. I am sure that now the audience will have many questions to you, but I would like to give the floor to head representative. No, please.
I just want to say hello to Daniela. How
Hi.
are you, Daniela? We miss you. Thank you. And you said an important bunch of things. The world order will change, like it or not. The important thing is to try to see how it's going to change. And the BRICS meeting today is of foremost importance. At the end, Vladimir Putin is not there because he could have been arrested. But among the BRICS, the only one who is converging with the levels of economics of the West is China. All others are not converging, but China is getting closer, not closer, but advancing towards our average GDP. And if the BRICS could accept all the candidates that want to join the group, I think it would be an impressive amount of population, an impressive amount of the world GDP too. And it's very, very important, this meeting, for us, for the, let's say, Western people, because it's clear that it is more the West and the rest. And the way that China and Russia will become closer, and the respective sizes of the two economies, Russia and a small economy, and China becoming a bigger and bigger economy, will be the decisive, the driving force of the future. So thank you for your enlightened speech. And now I am going to give the floor to the panelists, not to the panelists, to the attendees. I don't want to call them the students. They are not students. They are people very much interested in knowing where the world and where Europe is going to go. And it's going to go depending on where the others are going to go.
We are all of us students.
Yeah?
We are all of us students.
We are all of us
Independent of the
students.
ages. Okay,
Thank you, Canela. Thank you, Daniela.
Tengo dos preguntas de momento.
I've got two questions from the floor, one at the back of the room, two there, and Jesus Fernandez, 3-4, actually. Good morning, and thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. My name is José Luis Escario from the Alternativas Foundation. I'd like to comment the issue between China, Russia, and the US, especially after the COVID crisis, when there was like a drawback of the value chain and where we saw how Europe lacked certain important components. For example, the issue of chips, the chip problem, that we were incapable of producing these essential elements for production without depending on other parts of the world, in this case Taiwan or China. The Ukraine war has actually stepped up the Union's green transition so as to depend less on the fossil fuels coming from Russia, and EU has swiftly developed a decarbonized economy but has found several obstacles in its path. Firstly, China. China has a complete control over key raw materials, especially with regard to their production. And the US, as our speaker mentioned, has published a climate regulation, or they call it something else. They call it the IRA, which what it wants to do is to remove China's dominion over raw materials, and has also competed a great deal with Europe, and may take us, as the speaker said, to losing the green race, and in fact, finally deindustrialization. So my question is, the industrial plan of the European Green Deal that's been published by EU, which is partly based on national industrial policies and state aid, I don't know if it's going to have sufficient European funding to face these immense public programs that other parts of the world, for example, China has been involved in this since 2015, and the US has pulled its socks up recently. Is it going to be sufficient so as not to lose this race towards the green economy and avoid the deindustrialization of certain industries, such as the car industry? Thank you. Next question. Thank you so much. I'd like to know to what extent the speaker could share this feeling that I have increasingly relating to what she mentioned about the EU and US on the one hand and Russia and China on the other. I see that the international order is said to be based on rules, as provided the rules don't affect our interests. Otherwise, we skip those rules quite easily. But the current international order, is it something that we should be defending, especially when not only do we have a whole lot of problems, but also the fact that it causes many of these problems? So it's hardly surprising that countries such as China question this international order and want to get a foothold in the international scenario, a foothold that nobody's going to let them take easily, because for them to have a larger vote in the FMI, somebody has to have theirs reduced. So, the IMF, sorry, it has to be. So we see that there are different countries that aspire to dominate this. We're in a sort of a scenario in which, if I move towards the EU, the way I see EU, and this is my concern really, that we've sort of like lost our model. What do I mean by that? In the sense that our option from Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik and what Ms. Merkel did with regard to Russia and what China did, what Bill Clinton did with China regarding more international trade, because what we understand is that will bring us a safer and a fairer and a more democratic world, and it prevents democracies don't fight each other, has actually just completely collapsed, because this all works providing we all play the same rules of the game. Because Russia, what they've done is they've played with energy. China isn't playing the game, and it turns out that we Europeans depend upon Russia for energy, on China for our manufactured goods, so we're just left in a subordinated positions. I've got this feeling that we've sort of lost our way. We've lost our model when we're playing at any kind of new international order. The floor is yours. Good morning. And thank you so much to our speaker for her speaker. Russia is such a large country that we sometimes forget that it has the Pacific as part of its geography. And this is something, so therefore it's a natural, it's opening to Asia. When people talk about Vladivostok, this is a city which is completely closed to east. It looks towards Moscow and it's crowned in that way. What they want is to take Europe as far as they can to the Pacific coast. The political idea of opening towards Asia is not recent. Evgeny Primakov already spoke of the India, China, Russia triangle to act as a counterweight to a polarized world. In 2013, one of the ideas that came up time and time again in Russian public political sphere was this pivoting towards the east. All of these efforts have led to a certain failure. Russia hasn't been able to pivot eastwards. In fact, perhaps Europe and West has been more important or more relevant, perhaps. So the question that I want to ask is, why have these efforts failed? Has this eastward-looking turn failed? Perhaps it's been a reluctance of China and India, despite these public declarations of greater integration to Moscow. Or is it Moscow that's not able to articulate an alliance there? And if this failed, why now, in this context, is it more realistic to think of this greater coming together of China and Russia? Thank you. There's somebody there? And then we'll have a second round. Thank you for your talk. My name's Sergio Pardo. I'm a history student at Complutense University. And I've got a question about how you see the rise of India as a global player. A country whose economy is gradually growing. And in this world which people call multipolar, but which is actually really bipolar, with US and Europe on one side and China and Russia on the other side. What do you think about India as a new player, which may change this balance or may move the balance of powers, or as a new power there with its own interests? Daniela, the European Industrial Plan. Daniela, the classical European model, has it been exhausted? Russia isn't managing to turn to the east. What's happening with India? Very easy questions, as you may have noticed. Off you go.
Yes, thank you. Lovely question and thought-provoking, and really a matter for further engagement after this session. It's really a lot in there. Now, let me maybe start with the question: have we lost our model? First of all, I think we have not lost our model yet. I mean, we know what we stand for. We have a very strong single market, which is really the resource of power that is foremostly there. And at the same time, we also know how we would like the global order to look. And that is essentially rules-based, because our own model requires us to live in open economies at the moment. Any transition towards a really closed economy is costly and very difficult because of the fact that we don't have the resources to really live that model. So I do believe we know what we would like to see, and at the same time, we know that renegotiation of the order comes at a cost. Now, I think there is a material cost in two ways. One is the loss of power. This was mentioned by the speaker, that if we renegotiate voting weights in the Bretton Woods institution, or if there's a reform of the UN Security Council, or any other reform basically that we can look at, where we grant some leeway to the criticism that has been put forward, this means that those who have built the order, the US and its allies, they will have to give up something. So there's a loss of power. Second point, there may be, as we look at it, a short-term economic loss. Because of course, countries have used this current situation to build their models into it and to benefit from the structures as they are. But it is not only through an explicit change of the rules, but really because players change their behavior in an existing order that we have to readjust. And we saw this, for instance, through the costs that the development of the oil price had for us. We see it when we realize we don't have the access we thought we have to rare resources. So I think there is a clear awareness now that any change, and change is underway, we already feel it, comes at also an economic cost for us. And then there's a normative cost. If we look at the way we now, with far more caution than before, have to discuss normative-led foreign policy. So I would say, 20 years ago in the political West, it was assumed that the UN Charter is a reference point and that you can base US policy and other countries' foreign policy on the principles laid down there, and that you were somewhat legitimate in doing this. This is now heavily contested. So for instance, the human rights agenda, as right as it is from a normative perspective, and I deeply share this, is in a contested space far more than it used to be. So this whole idea of being able to change other countries' systems to comply by jointly agreed principles is now, has a big question mark. And I think this is, it's almost an identical question for foreign policy, but also for the way the West thinks about the normative base, about that new order. A number of countries haven't moved an inch in subscribing to the norms and principles laid out in the UN Charter and in human rights charters, but others have. And it is far more difficult in this world of shifting economic and political powers to credibly uphold a policy that strengthens those values practically. So I don't think we have lost the model as an answer to the question, but we are in very, very contested grounds. And in order to defend a model that corresponds to the way we think about democracy, about sovereignty, about the notion of not moving national borders by means of war, and many other elements, we can only make our voice credibly heard and have an impact, again, if we come from a position of strength. And I think that is why the other question is so relevant on, are we doing enough to counter industrial policy? And I would even enlarge the scope. It's not just industrial policy in terms of subsidies, but we are also facing another economic system, which is a state-led market economy, or, a state-led economy, which is China, where you have elements of real competitive market economy, but also a very protective and very backing state through not only financing, but also regulation and shielding of segments. Now, I think there are two questions in what you said. One is, what about the money that is already out there? And here, the EU did a lot in times of COVID. the Recovery Fund, which is a huge investment fund, and I think a path-breaking move by the European Union for two reasons. One is how the EU raised the money that is going to the markets at the EU, as the EU using treaty provisions which had been there before, but really to borrow money on a big scale, making use of the solidity of the EU to get money at cheap rates. And then the way the money is spent, both as loans, but also as transfers. This is hugely important. Now, with that tool, I think we see one issue, and that is the absorption capacity. Because I think the debate, do we have enough money, first needs the member states to be able to spend the money that is there on the transition jobs that are to be done, digital and green. And then comes the question, do we have enough? And I think once that money is channeled into really productive investment, then that next question comes up. And I personally think that, again, speaking as someone who knows the German debate very well, I can only warn that we make a mistake of not thinking strategically in terms of how big the investment need is in our European, but also in our domestic economies. We are right now in Germany returning to our own constitutional debt break after, the exceptional COVID years. At the same time, Europe faces the question, how do we deal with the Stability and Growth Pact, both in terms of not applying it because of exceptional circumstances, but then also the question of a reasonable reform. I'm deeply convinced that solid public finances are needed, but the question is it right at this moment where investment is needed to cut down on public spending? And you see already, and if you sometimes read news about Germany, you will find that there are very, very difficult trade-off decisions to be made. And I'll just name 3 areas, and those are also relevant for other EU member states and also for the EU as such. One is security has become a far more dominant issue. And we underinvest not only in defense, but also in other areas of security. Now we have our own first all government national security strategy, but it says that this should be cost neutral. That's a task which I personally believe is impossible to achieve. If it is true that we are facing a whole host of new security challenges that reach deep into our societies. The second point is the investment that we need to transform and make our economies newly competitive in a really new way. And the third element is everything we need to do for social and societal cohesion. We must not cut social spending at this moment, or education, or childcare. But those are the trade-offs that governments are facing at the moment. So while I am German in the sense that I don't think we should run into complete overspending and long-term deficit spending. That's not the point, but we need to realize that we are still in an economic situation which is difficult for the effect of the COVID crisis, but also, of course, the effect of the war and the higher energy prices and everything that comes with it, and the huge uncertainty we are facing. Last point on this, I don't think it's only about public spending, but the maybe as important task is to channel more private spending where we need it. And Europe has one, or the EU has one essential weakness, and that is the lack of the capital markets union, which on paper exists, in the minds of people. It has been developed as a concept. We need to implement it because one of our competitive problems is that investment, in particular into startups, small and medium-sized companies, innovative business models, is far more difficult to have in Europe. It's a cultural issue, but it's also a structural issue, and it really relates to the non-realization of capital markets union. So for those 2 questions, those are my answers. Then maybe the Russia and the Pacific opening, why did the pivot to the East never work out? I think, rhetorically, yes, this was very present in the Russian narrative for many years. So, but I wouldn't say it hasn't happened. Clearly not a pivot away from the East, because there is equally a very strong narrative by Putin that is totally focused on the Western neighbors on Russia, with his narrative of bringing home Russians, of extending Russian territory to former Soviet republics, which is a nationalistic, imperialistic narrative, but which has become essential to his own thinking about Russia and legitimizes wars and other measures which are, completely unacceptable. But for the ties to Asia, I mean, the armament exports to India have been substantial over years and have increased, and only now is India looking into alternatives more decisively than it ever has done before. So the newly negotiated projects with the US are a clear signal that there is a perception that India needs to diversify. So that's where Russia clearly invested and it worked. The other thing is energy ties, which were already on the rise before the beginning of this phase of the war with Asian countries, but are now really increasing. Because, of course, the European Union and other Western countries are decoupling from Russia, or have decoupled in energy terms. So the amount of raw oil, the new pipeline into China, which was a project before this phase of the war, all that makes me think that in terms of energy ties, not only has the war had an immediate effect, but structurally this is going to grow further for Russia. And then the final point, again, Russia's focus was also pretty much on the Middle East. So I see it as a country that has built the role of a regional power, has invested to some extent into ties with Asian countries, has also, conflictual relationships. If you look at Japan, Russia, and island disputes in the Pacific. But I think it was a strategy of having both. But then right now the war increases the necessity for Russia to intensify ties, for instance, with China, knowing this is happening from a situation of a weaker partner. Because the more Russia now needs economic ties with China because of sanctions, because it needs new markets for its oil and gas exports, the less balanced this relationship is, and the more you can really see the asymmetry between China and Russia. Just one final thought maybe on China and Russia's war. I think from a Chinese perspective, while I don't expect a direct intervention in the war, it is of course important that Russia does not lose that war. So we should not underestimate the support that de facto goes from China to Russia. People track that, and there is public data available on imports from China to Russia that is not hard weaponry, but that are dual-use technologies which have increased since the start of the war and are clearly used by Russia for the purposes of the war. Now I'm looking for the last question. If you can help me, that would be really good, because I just seem to have lost it. Oh, wait a minute, is it here? Oh, yes, India is a global player, right? Yeah, well, India, I've already talked about India's need to diversify its dependency on Russia's military exports to India. I mean, India is a huge player which has no easy relationship with China, of course. There are border conflicts, very long territorial line. China looks at India with a lot of caution, and the other way around. So I do not see a scenario emerging where we see an alliance between Russia, China, and India. From a Western perspective, that would really be a hugely important development in terms of weight that you have in terms of economic power, demography, military power. But I rather see India balancing its relationship with all sides, diversifying more than it used to, but clearly emerging as an own bigger actor in itself. It already is that. I mean, it's a huge country. It has a lot of potential if you look at the domestic digitization agenda. that is being pushed forward. That is really breathtaking. It is a democracy, but we also know that there are huge issues with minority rights and religious tensions. So I think it's extremely important to work with India on many of the current challenges we share. But we also need to look closely at what's happening within India and how the domestic situation will develop.
Muchas gracias, Daniela. Sé que estamos llegando al final.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I know we're getting to the end. I've got two more questions. The lady at the back of the room and then yourself.
I'm a China analyst at EUISS. Thank you so much, Daniela, for this very interesting and comprehensive presentation. I fully agree with you that we underestimated the level, at least the willingness of China and Russia to cooperate, to restructure regional and global governance. I would be very interested to hear your views about the future of China-Russia cooperation in the medium and long term. We emphasize a lot on the limits or the asymmetry of the relationship, but I believe it's a long-term rapprochement, but I would be interested to hear your views and also the point you made on energy is part of the answer, but I would be interested to hear your views. Thank you very much again, Daniela.
Yo quería hacer una pregunta.
I wanted to ask a very brief question. Because Taiwan is so specialist technologically, what is the EU's policy to solve the Taiwan problem?
So maybe the Taiwan question can go to Josep because it was on EU policy. So I would love to hear Josep on that one, because I really think that there are extremely important debates going on at the moment. Also because it is about Taiwan. It is about the relationship with China, and it is about the relationship with the United States when we think about this. I mentioned this earlier, that the pressure that Europeans will feel in the case of an escalation, and I don't only think about a military escalation, maybe that's the less probable scenario, but you can very well think of many ways how China can put pressure on Taiwan in terms of trade and kind of sea blockages and other ways. So I think there are ways how China can move closer and closer to its defined goal that it wants to retake full control over Taiwan. We shouldn't be illusionary about that. It has been said, it has been repeated, there's a date. So it seems that we are really moving into that direction. And the US clearly said that it's going to protect Taiwan. So maybe, I can just shed light on the state of the debate, but maybe Josep can add elements on whether we are moving towards a real EU policy. But we will have to decide, of course, the moment it happens, on whether we join sanction regimes against China, with the potential of having a higher price to bear than the United States. So that's just a warning, and again brings me to my point: the stronger we are, the more scope of external action we have. The other question on the perspective of the China and the Russia relationship developing, I think we see at least 3 sectors where I would expect more to happen, and then I'll come to red lines. So where do I think we will see more to happen? That's first of all energy. It's of mutual economic benefit. Russia needs to sell, and China needs cheap imports. Still heavily fuel dependent. Also, some of the countries where China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, is investing into fossil energy, some need resources. So it's part, I think, not only of a Chinese policy for China, but also for other neighboring countries that China is trying to have more influence on. The second point is technology. The sanction regime on Russia by the EU, the US, and other partners is very rigid. And although some companies manage to circumvent the sanction regime, some through Hong Kong, by the way, I believe that China will become an even more important partner for Russia in the area of technology. And then I think the whole question based on that is more defense cooperation. Now, I think for China, there will be a red line, and that is if it cannot balance this economic relationship and, in a way, support for Russia with its relationship with Europe and the US. So I think that's, the careful line that Beijing is trying to tread, that it does just that much and not more, not to be seen as explicitly circumventing some of the sanctions and being then subject to executorial sanction regimes, which go beyond the sanctions that it's already subject to. So we shouldn't forget that also China is in a situation of economic worries at the moment. So I do believe that while we have to look at China as a very strong and potential player, there are also domestic worries that the leadership is facing. And so I think for some time, this can keep China beyond away from a fuller and more visible support to Russia as the war is still ongoing.
Alto representante, no sé si quiere decir algo antes de clausurar.
High Representative, I don't know if you want to add something. If not, we are at the end of this debate. I remind you that tomorrow we will speak about China again. We will speak about China and the EU in the face of China's emergency. And in fact, Alice Eggman, who is now in the audience, will be part of the panel. And this afternoon, we will continue with a discussion at 3:30. We will have a panel session of Europe as a geopolitical actor in security and defense. Thank you, Daniela. We've all learned so much, learning about this magical triangle between China, the EU, and the US, in which we have to be present. And now I give the floor to the High Representative. Yes, in fact, there is a triangle, China, Europe, Russia, US, more than a triangle, it could be a square, let's say. But China and Russia are getting closer and closer, and then we have a triangle once again. But tomorrow we will be focusing on the issue of China once again, because it is true that China does have some concerning financial difficulties. It is also clear that the role of China is not limited to being one more amongst the BRIC countries. It needs the European market. So therefore it's different and differentiated. So whoever invented this acronym put them all together as the BRIC countries, but I would take China out, in fact. And we will also speak about Taiwan tomorrow when we speak about China and the complexity of our relationships with China.
A lot that you could not be here with us. But anyway, this system has worked quite well, and we could exchange as if you were here. But you will not be able to enjoy the weather in Santander. So that is going to be a pity. So let's hope that next year, if we have again this seminar, we'll count on you. Thank you.
I'd love to come then. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you so much.
And see how the BRICS meeting is going on. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bueno, les recuerdo que comenzamos a las...
I remind you that we start at 3:30 this afternoon. Thank you.